So what do the scrolls contain? I say this is a little repetitive. Won't harm you to reread some of this stuff. I'm amazed. And then be ready, read this a number of times, be ready to explain what the Dead Sea Scrolls maintain, because you can volunteer this subject to people who say, well, the Bible is written by men, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, over 1,000 years. Anybody live over 1,000 years lately? And the men that wrote it 1,000 years ago copied these books from the Old Testament. We've shown a number of examples where they're 99.999% corroborative. Only a few words and thousands of words have some question, and different spelling, different words, or whatever the omissions are, or whatever it might be, show no difference in the meaning. What do you think of that? No books like that. What do the scrolls contain? It will not be possible here to survey the more than 800 manuscripts represented by the scrolls. The following Isaiah sampling of the texts that have been studied for the last 40 years, including most of the older works on which the scrolls were based, and the recently published texts from the Cave 4. These texts can be grouped in categories: biblical, biblical commentaries, sectarian, pseudephigraphical, right, texts, apocalyptic texts, and mystical and ritualistic texts, of which most of these have little value in terms of containing the Word of God. Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries: Cave 1, discovered by Arab shepherd boy. From it he took 7 more or less complete scrolls and some fragments. Isaiah A, St. Mark's Monastery Isaish Scroll is a popular copy with numerous corrections above the line of and in the margin. It is the earliest known copy of any complete book of the Bible. Isaiah B, Hebrew University, Isaiah is incomplete, but its text agrees more closely with the Masoretic text than does Isaiah A. Other Cave 1 fragments. This cave also yielded fragments of Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Judges, Samuel, Isaiah. Oh, wow, I didn't know this. Ezekiel, I forgot this. Ezekiel, Psalms, and some non-biblical works, including Enoch, sayings of Moses, previously unknown, maybe, may not, Book of Jubilee, Book of Noah, Testament of Levi, Tobit, and the Wisdom of Solomon. An interesting fragment of Daniel containing 2:4, where the language changes from Hebrew to Aramaic, also comes to this cave, from this cave. Fragmentary commentaries on Psalms, Micah, and Zephaniah were also found in Cave 1. Cave 2. Cave 2 was first discovered and pilfered by the Bedouins. It was excavated in 1952. Fragments of about 100 manuscripts, including 2 of Exodus, 1 of Leviticus, 4 of Numbers, 2 or 3 of Deuteronomy, 1 each of Jeremiah, Job, and the Psalms, and 2 of Ruth were found. Cave 4, Partridge Cave, or Cave 4, after being ransacked by Bedouins, was searched in September 1952 and proved to be the most productive cave of all. Literally thousands of fragments recovered. Of course, these weren't fragments. They were just cut up so they could sell it by piece, make more money. Fragments were recovered by purchase from the Bedouins or by the archaeologists sifting the dust on the floor of the cave. These scraps represent hundreds of manuscripts, nearly 400 of which have been identified. They include 100 copies of Bible books, all of the Old Testaments except Esther. A fragment of Samuel from Cave 4 is thought to be the oldest known piece of biblical Hebrew. It dates from the 3rd century BC. Also found were a few fragments of commentaries of the Psalms, Isaiah, Nahum. The entire collection of Cave 4 is believed to represent the scope of the Qumran library, and judging from the relative number of books found, their favorite books seem to be Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms, the minor prophets, Jeremiah, in that order. In one fragment containing some of Daniel 7:28 and 8:1, the language changes from Aramaic to Hebrew. Cave 7 to 10, examined 1955, produced no significant Old Testament manuscripts. Cave 7 did, however, yield some disputed manuscript fragments that have been identified by Jose O'Callaghan as New Testament portions. If so, they would be the oldest New Testament manuscripts dating from as early as AD 50 or 60. Cave 11. This cave was excavated in early 1956. It produced a well-preserved copy of 36 Psalms, plus the apocryphal Psalm 151, previously known only in Greek texts, a very fine scroll of part of Leviticus, some large pieces of an apocalypse of the New Jerusalem, and an Aramaic Targum, a paraphrase of Job, were discovered. Several recent studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls provided detailed description and inventories. Gleason L. Archer, Jr. provides an appendix of his survey of Old Testament introduction. So we have a chart here. Now, Murabat discoveries. Prompted by the profitable finds at Qumran, the Bedouins pursued their search and found caves southeast of Bethlehem, that produced self-dated manuscripts and documents from the Second Jewish Revolt. So we have other systematic exploration and excavation of these caves began in 1952. The later dated manuscripts helped establish the antiquity of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we have some dating in there. From these caves came another scroll of the Minor Prophets, the last half of Joel through Haggai, that closely supports the Masoretic text. The oldest known Semitic papyrus, a palimpsest, inscribed the second time in the ancient Hebrew script, dating from the 7th to 8th centuries BC, was found here. Significant. And what have we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls so far, thinking about this? Nothing new. The significance of the Qumran documents to textual criticism can be seen in the following perspectives from Old Testament scholars. First and foremost, the Dead Sea Scrolls take the textual scholar back about 1,000 years earlier than previously known Hebrew manuscript evidence. Prior to the Qumran discoveries, the earliest complete copies of Old Testament books dated from about the early 10th century AD. The earliest complete copy of the entire Old Testament dated from the early 11th century AD. The Dead Sea manuscripts thus give much earlier evidence for the text of the Old Testament than anything previously known. So prior to the discovery of the scrolls at Qumran, the oldest extant manuscripts were dated from approximately AD 900. Some manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which included copies of Isaiah, Habakkuk, and others, were dated back to 125 BC, providing manuscripts 1,000 years older than previously available. The major conclusion was that there was no significant difference between the Isaiah scroll at Qumran and the Masoretic Hebrew text dated 1,000 years later, nor have there been announced any others for the other books of the Bible found in the Dead Sea Scrolls arena of the caves. This confirmed the reliability of our present Hebrew text. Together with extant material, the Dead Sea Scrolls, will do much to extend the frontiers of knowledge in the areas of history, religion, and sacred literature, historically speaking, but not necessarily supportive of the Word of God. Just it kind of places indirectly the area of that time. There can be no doubt that the Dead Sea Scrolls have ushered in a new era of biblical study in which much that was known will be confirmed. In other words, again, I say, what have we discovered in Dead Sea Scrolls? Nothing new. In conclusion, we should accord to the Masoretes the highest praise for their meticulous care in preserving so sedulously the consonants of the Sopherim, which had been entrusted to them. They, together with the Sopherim themselves, gave the most diligent attention to accurate preservation of the Hebrew Scriptures that has ever been devoted to any ancient literature, secular or religious, bar none, head and shoulders above all the most famous documents preserved throughout history, nothing in comparison to the Bible, in the history of human civilization. So conscientious were they in their stewardship of the holy text, they had to be inspired, that they did not even venture to make the most obvious corrections, so far as the consonants were concerned, but left their vorledge exactly as it had been handed down to them. Because of their faithfulness, we have today a form of the Hebrew text which in all essentials duplicates the recension which was considered authoritative in the days of Christ and the apostles, if not a century earlier. And this, in turn, judging from the Qumran evidence, goes back to an authoritative revision of the Old Testament text, which was drawn up on the basis of the most reliable manuscripts available for collation from previous centuries. Remember, yes, they had to get accurate manuscripts evidence in the Old Hebrew in order to make the 9th century, 10th century Masoretic text accurate, and they both correlate each other perfectly, almost 99.9%. This brings us very close in all essentials to the original autographs themselves and furnish us with an authentic record of God's revelation. Conclusion. Check against the Dead Sea Scrolls. With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars have Hebrew manuscripts dated 1,000 years earlier than the great Masoretic text manuscripts, enabling them to check the fidelity of that Hebrew text. Sorry for that jiggling around. There is a word-for-word identity in more than 95% of the cases, and the 5% variation consists mostly of slips of the pen and spelling, alternate spelling. The Isaiah Scroll from Qumran led the Revised Standard Version translators to make only 13 changes from the Masoretic text. 8 of those were known from ancient versions, and few were significant. Of the 166 Hebrew words in Isaiah 53, for example, only 17 Hebrew letters in the Isaiah B scroll differ from the Masoretic text. 10 letters are a matter of spelling, 4 stylistic changes, and the other 3 compose the word for light added in verse 11, of which does not affect the Hebrew meaning greatly. Furthermore, that word is also found in the same verse in the Septuagint and in the Isaiah scroll. So the various ancient translations called versions of the Old Testament provide the textual scholar with variable witnesses to the text. Septuagint example preserves a textual tradition from the 3rd century BC. These and the Masoretic text provide 3 Old Testament textual variations that, when critically evaluated, supply an overwhelming support for the integrity of the Old Testament text. The witness of the Samaritan Pentateuch, and especially that of the Septuagint with its revisions and recensions, is a major confirmation of the textual integrity. First, we have Jesus quoting for the Septuagint, which was the more popular. The Old Testament Masoretic text hadn't been done yet till 900 and some odd years later. So just as the Jews had abandoned their native Hebrew tongue for Aramaic in the Near East, so they abandoned the Aramaic in favor of Greek and such Hellenistic centers as Alexandria, Egypt. During the campaigns of Alexander the Great, the Jews were shown considerable favor. In fact, Alexander was sympathetic toward the Jews as a result of their policies toward him. In the siege of Tyre, he is even reported to have traveled to Jerusalem to pay homage to their God. As he conquered the new lands, he built new cities that frequently included Jewish inhabitants and often named them Alexandria. So we have other versions too.